definition because that doesn't help me. A mass, especially Catholic, to honor and...
A barefoot woman stood in the middle of a November night in Chicago. Her face was bruised. Her lip was split and bleeding. She held an 8-month-old baby tightly against her chest on the Michigan Avenue Bridge. Her eyes dimmed. Her knees buckled. Mother and child tipped toward the railing. 20 meters away, the door of a black Escalade flew open. A man in a black suit sprinted out. A $3,000 suit dropped to its knees on the dirty bridge. He grabbed them both in the instant they were falling. But he didn't rescue her and walk away. He stayed at the clinic for 9 hours that night, holding a baby he didn't know in his arms, putting on a diaper the wrong way and then taking it off to do it again. And at 4 o'clock in the morning, he softly sang "Fly Me to the Moon" down the hallway, so the little girl would fall asleep on his shoulder, his suit lapel smeared with baby drool. He was the kind of man the entire Chicago underworld feared, but that night, he was only a man holding a baby who wasn't his, and refusing to let go. The woman on the bridge had run from a devil. Someone had beaten her until she no longer dared to look into any man's eyes. She ran into the cold night with nothing but a torn backpack and a child who was the only reason she was still breathing. And then she collapsed into the hands of another devil. But this kind of devil knew how to sing her baby to sleep. 5 years later, they had 3 children. Stop for 1 second. Let that sentence sink in. This is their story, and it'll make you cry in a way you won't see coming. If this story touched you, please hit like so more people can hear it. Share it with someone you think needs to believe in love, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the stories that come next. To understand why Audrey Holloway stood on that bridge in the middle of a November night, barefoot, bruised, holding her 8-month-old daughter as if she were the last thing left in the world, you have to go back 6 years, back to a small town called Decatur, in Illinois, where everything began. Audrey Pennington grew up in a 1-story house at the end of a quiet street. The kind of house where the paint had been peeling since last year, but there was no money to fix it. Where the front yard grass grew past knee height because no one cut it. Her father left when she was 4. No letter, no birthday calls, not a single return. She had no memory of him except for one old photograph her mother kept in a drawer and never took out. Her mother, Diane Pennington, worked night shifts as a nurse at the county hospital. She worked from 7 in the evening to 7 in the morning, came home as Audrey was getting ready for school, slept a few hours, then got up to cook, do laundry, and check homework. Diane never said she was tired in front of her daughter, never cried, at least not where Audrey could see. She owned a silver bracelet, nothing expensive, just a plain silver band her mother had given her the day Diane graduated from nursing school. She wore it every day, while washing dishes, while mopping hospital floors at 3 in the morning. And every night before leaving for work, she sat beside Audrey's bed, turned the bracelet around her wrist, and said the same sentence. "You deserve to be loved the right way, Audrey. Never accept less than that." Audrey heard those words probably 1,000 times. So many times she memorized them without truly understanding them, until it was too late. When Audrey was 19, Diane went to the doctor for a persistent cough. The results came back as stage 3 breast cancer. The next 2 years were hell. Chemotherapy, radiation, hair loss, vomiting. Nights when Diane was in so much pain she bit into her pillow and made no sound because she was afraid her daughter might hear. Audrey dropped out of school and took a part-time job at a grocery store to help pay for medication. At 21, Audrey stood alone in the Decatur funeral home, in front of her mother's casket. No one came except a few of Diane's former co-workers and a neighbor who used to give Audrey cookies when she was little. No father, no relatives, just Audrey, 21 years old, standing there with her hand wrapped around the silver bracelet the nurse had removed from her mother's wrist before closing the casket, and the feeling that the entire world had walked out of the room at once. She sold the house in Decatur. It was just enough to pay off the remaining hospital debt and buy a bus ticket to Chicago. She had no plan beyond 2 changes of clothes, $400 in her wallet, and the vague idea that a big city would offer more chances. During her first 6 months in Chicago, Audrey lived in a shared room with 3 strangers and worked as a server at a bar in the West Loop. She had no friends, no one calling at the end of the day to ask if she had eaten, if she was tired, if she was okay. She went to work, went back to her room, lay staring at the ceiling, and the loneliness was not loud. It was quiet. It just sat there, in her chest, growing heavier every day. Then Travis Holloway walked into the bar. Tall, handsome, confident smile. The kind of man who knows he's attractive and knows how to use it. He ordered whiskey, left a tip 3 times the size of the bill, and said to Audrey, "Your smile is beautiful. Why do you look so sad?" She should have known. She should have seen how his attention was too perfect, his concern too well timed, his arrival too precisely placed in the empty space her mother had left behind. But when you've lost everything, when you have no one left in the world, the first person who says, "I'm here," can look like the entire world, even when that person is a trap. Travis said he worked in financial consulting, said his father was influential, said he wanted to take care of her, protect her, give her the family she had never had. He bought flowers every week, picked her up after late shifts, moved her out of the damp shared room into a larger apartment. 8 months later, they were married. A small ceremony at City Hall. No one on Audrey's side, because there was no one to invite. She signed the prenuptial agreement Travis's lawyer handed her, 30 pages thick, without reading it, because Travis said it was just a formality, because she trusted him. And she did trust him, because she was lonely enough to believe anyone who said exactly what she needed to hear. Looking back later, Audrey said the signs were there from the beginning. The way Travis always wanted to know where she was. The way his face tightened when she spoke to male coworkers. The way he said, "You don't need to work anymore, I can handle it," in a tone that wasn't an offer but an order. But she didn't see it, or didn't want to see it, because seeing it would have meant losing the only person she had left, and the trap closed faster than she ever imagined. In the first month after the wedding, Travis didn't hit Audrey. He didn't need to. He controlled her. That was more dangerous than fists, because it arrived slowly, gently, wrapped in concern so thoroughly that the victim didn't realize she was being shut in until the door was already locked. In the first week, Travis told her she should quit her job at the bar. "You're working too much, and I don't want you exhausted. I can take care of it." Audrey thought that was love. In the second week, he took her phone and checked her messages. "I just want to know who you're talking to. Husband and wife shouldn't hide things from each other." Audrey thought that was trust. In the third week, she realized she wasn't in contact with anyone outside the apartment anymore. Old coworkers' numbers were deleted. Social media was locked. Travis kept the bank card, handed her cash each week, just enough to buy food, and he checked every item on every receipt. She didn't have a car. She didn't have a driver's license, and the apartment they lived in was on the 12th floor of a high-rise on North Michigan Street. 12 floors, far enough that no one would hear anything. In the third month, Travis came home after dinner with business partners, carrying the haze of alcohol. Audrey had forgotten to iron the white shirt he'd told her to. That was the first time. A slap. Fast, hard, so sudden Audrey fell off her chair. She sat on the floor with her hand pressed to her cheek, staring up at Travis, not understanding what had just happened. He stood there for 3 seconds. Then he dropped to his knees, held her, and cried, "I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I don't know why I did that. I swear I'll never do it again." He bought flowers the next day. He booked dinner at a French restaurant. He fastened a platinum necklace around her neck. And Audrey forgetting him, because she thought everyone messed up sometimes. Because her mother was gone and there was no one left to call. Because she had no one else but Travis. And because losing him felt like the same thing as absolute loneliness. But the second time came faster. 1 week later, the rice was a little too salty. Travis knocked the whole plate to the floor, then punched her in the stomach. The third time, she looked at a man on television for too long. Travis dragged her by the hair from the living room into the bedroom. The fourth time, she asked to visit her mother's grave in Decatur. Travis threw a glass at the wall 10 centimeters from her head. Every time, there was a reason. Every time, Travis could explain why it was her fault. And every time, he apologized afterward, bought gifts, turned gentle for a few days, and then hit her again. That spiral never stopped. It only spun faster. The space between the beatings shortened. The apology gifts got cheaper. The reasons got thinner. Until there didn't need to be a reason at all. Travis got drunk every night. Whiskey, bourbon, anything. When he was drunk, he became someone else. Clouded eyes, slurred voice, heavy hands. When he was sober, he was perfect Travis Holloway again, the son of federal judge Howard Holloway, wearing a suit, shaking hands with partners, smiling brightly at parties. No one knew. No one wanted to know. Audrey called the police exactly once. The night Travis beat her so badly she vomited blood into the kitchen sink. 2 officers came, looked at the luxury apartment, looked at Travis in polite sleepwear, then looked at Audrey with a gaze she'd never forget. They made a call, not to the station, but to Judge Holloway. 15 minutes later, they left. No report, no record. One of them came back and whispered to Audrey at the door, "You should be more careful. Don't make your husband angry." That night, Travis punished her for daring to call the police. And Audrey understood that the system she thought would protect her was the very thing that kept her trapped. After that, Audrey learned how to use makeup to cover bruises. Not the kind of makeup people do for fun. This was a survival skill. She knew which foundation could hide a 3-day bruise, which one could hide a 7-day bruise. She knew how to use green concealer to neutralize purple, then lay skin-toned foundation over it. She knew how to wear sunglasses indoors without being questioned. She knew how to smile when every rib hurt. She lived like that for 2.5 years. 2.5 years hiding behind foundation and a false smile. Then Audrey got pregnant, and everything changed. Not because Travis stopped, but because now there was someone else inside her. Travis hit her even when she was pregnant. One night, in the 6th month, he was so drunk he could barely stand, and he kicked her straight in the belly because she dared to lock the bedroom door. Audrey went down on the kitchen floor, curled up, both hands over her stomach, feeling the baby kick inside her. Still kicking, still alive. Blood rushed between her legs, but the baby still kicked, and Audrey lay there on the cold kitchen floor, the stench of bourbon Travis had spilled on the tiles burning in her nose, thinking only one sentence: "I have to live for my child." She wasn't weak. Don't ever think she was weak. She was surviving. There's a difference between the two. Weak is giving up. Surviving is enduring every day, every hour, every minute, until the day you can get out. And from that night on the kitchen floor, Audrey didn't pray to be rescued anymore. She started planning how to rescue herself. Zoe was born in March, healthy, weighing 3.2 kilograms. Crying so loudly, the nurse laughed and said the baby's lungs were excellent. Audrey held her child on the hospital bed, looked at that wrinkled, flushed little face, and for the first time in 3 years, she cried over something that wasn't pain. She named her Zoe, meaning life, because life was the only thing she had left. And from the day Zoe was born, the plan Audrey had been carrying since the night she lay on the kitchen floor began to move from thought into action, slowly, inch by inch, so secret that not a single breath was allowed to go wrong. Travis gave Audrey cash every week to buy things for Zoe: diapers, formula, clothes, medicine. He checked the receipts, checked the change, counted every dollar. But Travis never bought anything for his child himself. He didn't know how much a pack of diapers cost, how many dollars a can of formula was, or how cheap the least expensive newborn outfit at Target could be. And Audrey used that indifference. Every day, she added $5, $10. She said the diapers cost $12 when they really cost $10. She said the formula was $17 when it was actually $14. The difference was small, not enough for Travis to suspect anything, but enough that after 4 months, Audrey had $340. She hid the money in a small zip bag, shoved deep into the bottom of a backpack, the old backpack from her college years that Travis never looked at, pushed far behind stacks of blankets and pillows in the closet. $340. It sounded small, but it was 4 months of trembling every single day, her heart pounding every time she slid a $5 bill into the zip bag at the bottom of the backpack, afraid Travis would open the closet, afraid he would count the change again, afraid he would see it in her eyes as she hid it. During those 4 months, every day could have been the last if he found out. $340, not enough for one decent night in a hotel in downtown Chicago, but it was the price of her freedom. In the backpack, besides the money, Audrey prepared 2 sets of clothes for Zoe: 4 diapers, 1 bottle, half a can of formula, Zoe's birth certificate that she'd stolen from the drawer of Travis's desk while he slept off his drinking, and her mother's silver bracelet. The bracelet Diane wore every day. The bracelet Audrey had taken from her mother's wrist at the funeral home in Decatur, the only thing that still connected her to the person who had loved her without conditions. She didn't have a passport because Travis kept it. She didn't have a driver's license because Travis wouldn't let her take the test. She didn't have a credit card because everything was in his name. She didn't have her own phone because Travis controlled the only one in the apartment. She had nothing but that backpack, Every night, after Travis passed out drunk, Audrey lay in bed and recited bus routes in her head. Route 11 from North Michigan heading south, Route 6 going west. The last bus left at 12:30 in the morning. She repeated them again and again, like memorizing the most important exam of her life. Because this truly was the most important exam she'd ever face. One wrong step, and Travis would find out. And that time, she knew he wouldn't just hit her. Audrey waited for the moment. And the moment came on the night of November 12th. Travis came home at 11 at night, so drunk he kicked the door open instead of turning the handle. The smell of bourbon flooded the living room. He threw the bottle at the wall, glass exploding less than 10 centimeters from Audrey's head. Zoe was asleep in the crib in the bedroom and woke up screaming. And Travis did something he'd never done in 3 years. He turned toward the crib. He stepped toward Zoe. His eyes were clouded, his hand gripping the crib rail, his voice growling, telling her to shut the baby up. Audrey didn't think. Her body moved before her mind did. She rushed forward, placed herself between Travis and the crib, her back to him, both hands gripping the rail to shield Zoe. Travis punched her in the back of the head. She fell forward, her face slamming into the crib rail, her lips splitting, blood running down her chin and dripping onto Zoe's blanket. But she didn't move back. For the first time in 3 years, she didn't move back. She stood there, blood on her mouth, looking straight into Travis's eyes, and in her gaze was something he'd never seen in her before. Not fear, determination. Travis staggered, cursed a few more times, then collapsed onto the living room sofa. 2 minutes later, his snoring filled the apartment. Audrey stood frozen for another 10 minutes, counting every breath, making sure he was deep asleep. Then she wiped the blood from her mouth with her sleeve, took the backpack from the closet, wrapped Zoe in a thin blanket, strapped her to her chest, and went out the back door. It was 11:47 at night. She wasn't wearing shoes, not because she forgot, but because her shoes were on the rack by the front door, right next to the sofa where Travis was sleeping. The old apartment's wooden floor creaked with every step. If she went to get the shoes, she'd have to cross the living room, past Travis. One creak at the wrong moment, one step too heavy, and he'd wake up, and everything would be over. She chose bare feet. It was 2 degrees Celsius outside. The November wind in Chicago cut into her skin like knives. But between shoes and the lives of a mother and her child, Audrey didn't need to think long. She stepped into the November night of Chicago barefoot, carrying her baby. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't go back. The first step onto the sidewalk outside the building almost made Audrey turn back, not because of Travis, but because of the cold. The 2 degrees Celsius cold of Chicago in November wasn't ordinary cold. It didn't arrive gently. It attacked. It bit into the soles of her bare feet like hundreds of tiny needles striking at once, piercing skin, flesh, bone. The first step hurt. The second step hurt more. By the 10th step, her toes began to go numb. By the 100th step, she couldn't feel her feet at all. And that was only the first 5 minutes. Audrey held Zoe with both arms, pressing the baby tight against her chest, inside the only thin coat she'd managed to grab. Zoe was wrapped in a blanket, pressed skin to skin, the warmth of Audrey's body, the only heater the baby had. But Audrey's body was losing heat faster than she'd expected. She hadn't eaten all day because Travis was angry and wouldn't let her touch the kitchen. Blood still seeped from the split in her lip, drying in the cold wind, cracking open again each time she pressed her mouth together. With every step, she felt the street through the soles of her feet. Loose gravel, concrete seams, then a patch of frozen water she stepped into that sent a shock through her body, but she didn't dare cry out. She didn't dare stop, because she knew if she stopped, if she sat down for even 1 minute, she wouldn't be able to stand again. 4 kilometers from the building to the nearest bus stop. 4 kilometers sounded short, an ordinary walk of about 45 minutes. But barefoot, in 2-degree weather, with cutting wind, holding an 8-month-old baby, lips bleeding, the body of a woman malnourished for 3 years, those 4 kilometers stretched as long as an entire lifetime. Audrey walked and tried not to think about her feet. She thought about her mother. She thought about Diane Pennington, the woman who worked 12-hour night shifts, and still came home to cook for her child without ever complaining of being tired. Her mother had walked farther than this. Her mother had endured more than this. And her mother hadn't given up. Audrey wouldn't either. She thought about Travis. It was midnight now. He was drunk to the point of unconsciousness. But alcohol wears off. If he woke at 2 a.m. and found Audrey and Zoe gone, he'd call his father. His father would call the police. The police would find her within a few hours. That was all the time Audrey had. A few hours. She thought about Zoe. She looked down. The baby was asleep. Eyes closed. Lips slightly parted. Tiny breaths warming Audrey's chest. Zoe didn't know anything. She didn't know her mother was running. She didn't know the world outside was freezing. She didn't know there was blood on her blanket. She only knew her mother was holding her, and that was enough. She trusted her mother completely, and that blind trust weighed more than any backpack, heavier than any pain in Audrey's feet, because it meant Audrey wasn't allowed to fall. The bus stop came into view at 12:20 in the morning. Audrey could barely feel her feet anymore. She looked down. The soles were dark red and bruised, scraped in places, oozing blood mixed with dirt. The last night bus was parked there, pale yellow light spilling through its windows. The driver was a middle-aged man with dark skin and a baseball cap. Audrey stepped onto the bus, and the driver looked at her, looked closely, the bruised face, the split lip crusted with dried blood, bare feet, dirty and red, a baby wrapped in a thin blanket. 1 second, 2 seconds. He didn't ask for a ticket. He didn't ask where she was going. He didn't ask what had happened. He just nodded once and looked forward. Sometimes kindness isn't a grand act. Sometimes it's just a nod at the right moment from a stranger who asks no questions, because he understands the answers wouldn't change anything. But the nod might. Audrey sat in the back row, holding Zoe, trembling. Not trembling from the cold anymore. Trembling from relief. Trembling from fear. Trembling because she'd just done the thing she'd planned for 4 months, and still couldn't believe she'd truly done it. The bus carried her toward downtown Chicago. She got off on Michigan Avenue at 1 a.m. She stood on the sidewalk, looking at a city of 8 million people, and didn't know where to go. She knew no one. She had no phone. She had no address to head toward. Her plan ended at the bus stop. After that was emptiness. She started walking along the Chicago River. No destination. Just walking. Because standing still was colder. Because stopping was more frightening. Because if she didn't move, she would collapse right where she stood. The wind off the river slapped her face like an open hand. 2 hours. 2 hours walking along the river, holding Zoe, bare feet on frozen concrete, and her body began to say goodbye. The ringing in her ears came first. A high, thin sound, like a mosquito, then louder, swallowing every other sound. The wind disappeared. The traffic disappeared. Only the ringing remained. Then her vision blurred. Her field of sight narrowed from the edges, as if someone were drawing a black curtain inward from both sides. Her feet carried her onto the Michigan Avenue Bridge, though she didn't remember arriving there. Her knees began to shake. Not from the cold, from a body that no longer had enough blood, enough energy, enough of anything to keep her upright. She tried to grab the railing. Her hand slipped. Numb fingers couldn't grip. In her mind, all thoughts vanished except one sentence repeating over and over like a heartbeat slowing down. Don't drop the baby. Don't drop the baby. Don't drop the baby. She pulled Zoe tight against her chest. Both arms locked, and her knees buckled. Everything went black. She didn't know that 20 meters away, a man had just looked up from his phone. Beckett Crane sat in the back seat of a black Escalade, eyes fixed on his phone screen, scrolling through a contract his attorney had sent 30 minutes earlier. The late-night meeting had just ended. Leo Marsh drove in front, silent as always, taking his boss home along the familiar route over the Michigan Avenue Bridge. An ordinary night. An ordinary city. Nothing worth looking up for. But Beckett looked up. Later, he would think about that moment every day for the rest of his life. He didn't know why he looked up. Maybe it was the streetlights reflecting off the window. A little too bright. Maybe it was instinct. Maybe it was something deeper. Something he never believed in and still couldn't explain. As if the universe forced him to look at that exact moment, in that exact place, in that exact second. He saw a figure on the bridge, staggering, holding something to her chest, a baby. He focused through the glass. The woman was going down, her knees buckled, her body tipping toward the railing. If Beckett had kept his eyes on his phone for 5 more seconds, he wouldn't have seen anything. Leo would have driven over the bridge, gone home, and the next morning the news would have carried a small line about a woman and a baby found on the Michigan Avenue Bridge. If Leo had taken a different route, the one over Columbus, instead of Michigan, 3 lives would have ended on that concrete span that night. But Beckett looked up, and the reason he looked up, the reason his body reacted before his brain could catch up, was connected to a 9-year-old girl who fell on a staircase 22 years ago, connected to blonde hair, laughter, and a shout of Beck that he still heard every month when he visited the nursing home. But that comes later. Beckett didn't say a word to Leo. He opened the car door before the SUV had fully stopped. Leo slammed the brakes and muttered a curse, but Beckett was already out. 20 meters. He ran 20 meters across the bridge in a few seconds, polished leather shoes striking concrete, suit coat flaring behind him. He made it in time. One hand caught her back, the other cradled the back of her head, just as her knees hit the bridge deck. A $3,000 suit dropped to filthy, cold concrete. The baby was wedged between the woman's chest and Beckett's arm. Safe, not a scratch. Beckett looked down, and what he saw made his jaw tighten. Her face was bruised, not the kind of bruises you get from falling, the kind you get from being hit. He knew the difference. He'd grown up with that difference. Her lip was split, dried blood streaking down her chin, bare feet, soles dark red and bruised, scraped raw, filthy, a thin coat, not warm enough for a 10-degree night, let alone 2. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a drunk woman or someone who'd lost her way. Someone had done this to her. Someone had hit her, and she had run. Beckett pulled off his suit coat and covered her and the baby. Then he turned toward the car, where Leo had come up and stopped 3 steps away, staring at the scene with an expression Beckett rarely saw on that man. Confusion. Beckett spoke in a flat voice, but every word was an order. Call Dr. Brennan. Tell him to prep a room. Right now. Leo didn't ask why they weren't calling an ambulance. Leo didn't ask why they weren't taking her to a public hospital. Leo had worked for Beckett long enough to understand. A public hospital calls the police. The police ask for identification. Identification leads to a name. The name leads to the husband, the father-in-law, or whoever had beaten her badly enough that she'd run barefoot into the November night with an 8-month-old baby in her arms. And the police, instead of protecting her, could send her back to the very place she'd just escaped. Beckett knew how the system worked. He'd lived outside it long enough to know who it protected and who it abandoned. While Leo made the call, Audrey opened her eyes, dimly, unfocused, like she was looking through water. She saw a man's face, close, right above her, and her reaction wasn't relief. It wasn't gratitude. It was horror. She flinched, clutched Zoe tight to her chest as if shielding the baby from him, tried to scramble backward, but her body had no strength. She only dragged herself a few centimeters across the bridge deck. Her eyes went wide, white around the irises, the eyes of an animal driven into a corner. She wasn't afraid of fainting. She wasn't afraid of the cold. She was afraid of him, afraid of a man's hands, afraid of a man's face close to hers. Because for 3 years, every time a man's face came near, it meant pain. Beckett recognized it immediately. He'd seen that look before, in his mother's eyes, 22 years earlier, when she had crumpled on the kitchen floor and his father stood over her. The look of someone so used to being hit that the first reflex at the sight of a man is fear. And it cut into Beckett's chest in a way he hadn't braced for. He, the man Chicago wouldn't dare meet in the eye, was making an exhausted woman terrified simply because he was a man. He stepped back. 1 step. 2 steps, far enough that she wouldn't feel threatened. Then he lowered himself and sat down on the bridge, level with her eyes, not standing over her, not looking down at her. His voice dropped, slow, 1 word at a time, like he was speaking to a panicked child. I won't touch you if you don't want me to, but you need a hospital. Your baby needs you awake. Let me help. Audrey looked at him. Her breathing was shallow, fast, steam rising from her mouth in the cold night. Her eyes were still afraid, but somewhere inside that fear, deeper than fear, there was something else. Exhaustion. Exhaustion so complete there wasn't enough strength left to be afraid. And for the first time in 3 years, a man asked her before touching her. Not ordering, not grabbing her wrist, not deciding for her, asking, "Let me help." She nodded, slightly, almost invisible. Then her eyes closed, and she lost consciousness again. But this time Zoe was still safe in her arms. And Audrey wasn't lying on cold concrete anymore. She was in the arms of a stranger whose name she didn't know. And Beckett Crane, the man who never stayed for anyone, The man whose life had taught him that involvement meant weakness and weakness meant death, stayed that night. Dr. Brennan's clinic sat on the second floor of an old building on West Randolph Street. No sign outside, no listing anywhere, known only to those who needed to know. It was where Beckett took his people when they couldn't go to a hospital. Tonight, for the first time, he brought someone who wasn't his. Dr. Brennan, 60 years old, silver hair, hands still steady from his years as a military surgeon, didn't ask a single question when he saw Beckett carrying an unconscious woman and Leo following with the baby in his arms. He only said, "Put her on the bed," and then he went to work. The results came back within 30 minutes, and every number told a story without a single word. Hemoglobin 6.8, when normal should be above 12, meaning she was so severely anemic her body barely had enough oxygen to function. 2 cracked ribs, old injuries, not fully healed, meaning she'd had her ribs broken at least weeks earlier and never received treatment. Hypothermia, malnutrition. Her body was like a machine that had run out of fuel long ago but kept crawling forward because there was a baby in the back seat. Dr. Brennan said she needed a blood transfusion immediately. IV fluids, iron supplementation, and monitoring for at least 48 hours, possibly longer. He turned to Beckett and asked the same questions his nurse had asked earlier, questions Beckett had answered with a shake of his head. "Are you her husband?" "No." "Family?" "No." "Is there anyone I should call?" "Family? Friends? Anyone?" Beckett was silent for 3 seconds, then said, "There's no one. There's no one." Those 3 words weighed more than every number on the lab report that night. Heavier than hemoglobin 6.8, heavier than cracked ribs, because those things medicine could treat. But no one, no doctor could fix that. A 27-year-old woman and an 8-month-old baby, and no one in the world. Dr. Brennan took Audrey into the treatment room. Zoe was checked quickly, completely healthy, not a single scratch, warm from being pressed against her mother's chest all night. Then Zoe was brought to the waiting area, where Beckett Crane, the man whose name the entire Chicago underworld knew, sat on a hard plastic chair under fluorescent lights, staring at the baby in Leo's arms like she was a bomb that could go off at any moment. Leo looked back at his boss with the same expression, the 2 most powerful men in the room, and neither of them knew what to do with an 8-month-old baby. At 1:30 in the morning, Zoe started to fuss. The crying began small, then grew, then turned into a scream. Leo held her, his face calm but his body rigid, like he was holding explosives. "Want me to call someone?" Leo asked, his voice steady to the point of being fake. Beckett looked around. The waiting room was empty. 1 in the morning. No one there but them. No woman to ask for help. No free nurse. He looked at Leo, looked at Zoe crying louder and louder, then said, "Google how to calm a baby." And Leo Marsh, a man who'd handled situations most of humanity never wanted to imagine, pulled out his phone and actually Googled how to calm a crying infant. At 2 in the morning, Zoe was hungry. Beckett opened Audrey's backpack, the old canvas bag with the broken zipper, and found inside a bottle and half a can of formula. He read the instructions on the label. 30 milliliters of warm water for 1 scoop of powder. The first time he mixed it, it was too thick. Zoe spat it out, frowned, cried harder. Leo reread the instructions from his phone. Beckett mixed it again. The second time, the ratio was right. Zoe drank and went quiet immediately, eyes closing, tiny hands wrapping around Beckett's index finger, holding tight, as if her whole world had collapsed into a single finger, and Beckett looked at his hand. That hand had done things he didn't want to think about. Things that made people fear him, made an entire city bow its head. But this baby didn't know. She didn't know what that hand was or what it had done. She only knew it was warm, and she held on because it was the only thing she had right now. That trust wasn't frightening. It was heavy, heavier than anything Beckett had ever carried. At 3 in the morning, Zoe needed a diaper change. Beckett had never changed a diaper in his life. The first time he taped it on backward, the diaper facing the wrong way. The second time it slipped off the moment he picked Zoe up. The third time, after Leo Googled again and showed him a diagram, Beckett got it right. He looked at the result, then at Zoe, and said very seriously, "If the guys ever find out about this, I'm retiring." Zoe laughed. She didn't understand a thing, but she laughed. And Beckett, the man Chicago wouldn't dare look in the eye, almost laughed with her. He sat back down with Zoe in his arms. She lay against his chest, her ear over his heart, her eyes starting to droop. And in that moment, Beckett looked at Zoe's pale blonde hair, at the tiny hand gripping the lapel of his suit, and he saw Molly, his sister. 5 years younger than him, blonde hair, just like Zoe's. Always smiling, always trailing after him, always calling Beck, Beck, whenever he came home from school. Molly was 9 years old when the men came to the house to collect his father's debt. Their mother was beaten. Molly panicked, ran, fell on the stairs. Her head hit the last step. Traumatic brain injury, permanent damage. Now Molly was 31 years old, but her mind was still 9. She lived in a care facility. Beckett visited every month. Molly still called Beck when she saw him, still smiled, still held his hand like nothing had ever happened. That was the only clean part left in Beckett Crane's life. He saw every time he hadn't been fast enough to save someone. But tonight, on the Michigan Avenue Bridge, he'd been fast enough. This time, he'd made it. Zoe slept for 1 hour. Then, at 4 in the morning, she opened her eyes and decided that sleep was an unnecessary concept. At 4 in the morning, Zoe opened her eyes, stared up at the clinic ceiling with wide blue eyes, and then began to babble. Not crying, just soft sounds, syllables tumbling out as if she were chatting with someone only she could see, and Beckett looked down at the baby on his chest, who had slept for exactly 1 hour and clearly had no intention of going back to sleep. So he tried the old methods. Gentle pats on her back, a slow rocking motion. But Zoe babbled louder. Then he tried laying her down on the chair, with his suit jacket folded underneath as a cushion. And Zoe cried instantly, the kind of cry that seemed to shake the walls. So he picked her back up, and she stopped. Put her down again, and she cried. Picked her up again, and she stopped. And Beckett understood then that she didn't want to lie down. She wanted to be held, and he was the only one there to hold her. So he started walking. Zoe over his shoulder, one hand supporting her, the other patting her back, pacing up and down the clinic hallway, back and forth, fluorescent lights flickering overhead, their shadows, one large and one small, stretching along the white walls. Zoe still babbling, refusing sleep, and Beckett realized he didn't know any lullabies. He'd grown up on the south side of Chicago where you learned how to fight before you learned how to read. Nobody had taught him lullabies. So he tried making low soothing sounds that he thought might count as singing, and Zoe cried louder, clearly unimpressed. Then he tried whistling, and Zoe kept crying. Then he tried whispering shh, shh, over and over, and Zoe paused for 1 second, and then cried twice as hard, as if personally offended, while Leo stood at the end of the hallway with his arms crossed, watching, his face blank but the corner of his mouth twitching as he tried not to laugh. And Beckett knew it. And he also knew that if he turned around right now, Leo would deny it completely. And then Beckett started to sing. Not because he wanted to, but because he was out of options, and it was the only song he could remember. Fly me to the moon. Let me play among the stars. His voice rough and low, off-key and off-rhythm. The kind of voice that would get bottles thrown at you in a karaoke bar. But Zoe went silent instantly, lifted her head and looked at him with wide eyes and a slightly open mouth, as if she were hearing something worth listening to for the first time, and Beckett kept singing, "Let me see what spring is like on Jupiter and Mars." That song, his mother's song, Ruth Crane, a grocery store cashier at a food mart on the south side. Afternoon shift from 2 until 10, coming home smelling like grease and cleaning chemicals, but always smiling, who'd raised Beckett and Molly alone after his father left when Beckett was 7, who never spoke badly about her ex-husband in front of her children, only ever said, "We'll manage." And she had managed. Every night sitting by Beckett's and Molly's beds, singing "Fly Me to the Moon," her voice not good either. Rough and off rhythm, exactly like Beckett's now, but it had been the safest sound in the world. Ruth had died 5 years ago of lung cancer. She'd never smoked, but 40 years breathing factory smoke and street dust on the south side had taken her lungs before she ever reached retirement. Beckett had stayed by her bed until the end, her hand small and thin and bony but gripping his tight. And she'd said the last words he'd carry for the rest of his life. "I know what you do out there. I don't pretend not to know. But I also know why you do it. For Molly, for me, keep the good part of you alive, Beckett. Don't let it die. The good part." Beckett wasn't sure if it was still alive, or if it had died long ago. He'd done too many things meant to kill it. But tonight, at 4 in the morning, in a clinic hallway under flickering fluorescent lights, he was singing his mother's song to a baby he didn't know, and that good part stirred, just slightly, like something that had lain still for a long time, under thick dust, and was touched for the first time. Zoe fell asleep on his shoulder before the song ended, her head tipping into the hollow of his neck, her tiny breath warming his skin, her hand still gripping the lapel of his suit, and he kept walking the hallway for another 10 minutes, not daring to stop for fear she'd wake. Then he sat down on the plastic chair, slowly, as carefully as possible, and closed his eyes. And at 6 a.m, Leo returned with 2 cups of coffee, stopped at the doorway to the waiting room, and didn't step inside. Beckett had dozed off in the chair, head tilted to one side, mouth slightly open, Zoe curled on his chest, her tiny hands clenched in the lapel of a $3,000 suit, her face pressed against him, sleeping so deeply she didn't stir, the lapel damp with drool, the sleeve wrinkled, Beckett's hair a mess. Leo stared for a long moment, because in 10 years of following Beckett Crane, he'd never seen his boss look like this. Peaceful. Not the peace of someone resting, but the peace of someone exactly where they were meant to be. Leo set the coffee down on the table and glanced at the chair beside it, where Audrey's old canvas backpack lay open. And inside, among baby clothes and a nearly empty can of formula, was a small zip bag filled with cash, all $5 and $10 bills, crumpled and folded again and again. Leo didn't count it, but he could tell it wasn't much. A few $100s at most, all small bills, the kind of leftover money someone hid day by day, bill by bill, over 4 long months. Beckett had seen it too earlier in the night while looking for a bottle for Zoe, and he hadn't said anything. There was no need for explanations. $340. 4 months of hiding, the price of freedom for a mother and her child. And he understood why she'd run barefoot, because when freedom costs $340, shoes don't make the priority list. And at 7 a.m, Dr. Brennan stepped out of the treatment room, pulled off his gloves, and looked at Beckett still sitting there with Zoe on his chest, and said, "She's awake, and she's panicking because she doesn't know where her baby is." Audrey opened her eyes and didn't know where she was. A white ceiling, fluorescent light, the sharp smell of medical alcohol, an IV needle in her hand, tubing leading to a fluid bag hanging above. She looked left, she looked right, searching for the only thing that mattered. The crib was empty. There wasn't even a crib. There was no Zoe. Her heart stopped for 1 beat, then started again. Fast, hard, chaotic. She yanked at the IV line, the needle nearly slipping free, tried to sit up but her body wouldn't obey, lifting only halfway off the bed before dropping back down. She called out, but no sound came, only a hoarse breath. She tried again, and this time the words broke free, cracked and shaking, almost a scream. "Where's Zoe? Where's my baby?" "Zoo, doctor." Brennan rushed in first and gently held her shoulders. "Mrs. Holloway, calm down. She's safe. She's right outside." But Audrey didn't hear him. 3 years with Travis had taught her that safe was a word people said right before everything collapsed. Safe was the word Travis used every time after he apologized. She needed to see Zoe, needed to touch Zoe, needed to know her baby was truly here, truly alive, truly not taken away. "Doctor." Brennan turned to the door and nodded, and Beckett stepped in. He didn't look like he had on the bridge, that blurred shape through water and darkness. His suit was wrinkled, like it had been crushed and put back on. His sleeves were rolled up to the elbows. The left lapel held a damp stain that Audrey would later learn was Zoe's drool. There were shadows under his eyes. His hair was tousled, a faint roughness along his jaw from a night without sleep. And on his shoulder, Zoe was asleep. Her head rested against his neck, one hand gripping his lapel, the other hanging loose, her mouth slightly open, asleep so deeply she knew nothing. Safe. Truly safe. Audrey saw her daughter, and everything inside her broke at once. She cried. Not the kind of crying where tears simply slide down your cheeks. The kind that erupts from deep in the chest, from the place where she had forced everything down for 3 years. Fear, pain, loneliness, despair. All of it bursting loose at once like a dam giving way. She reached both hands toward Zoe, shaking so hard she could barely control her fingers. Opening, closing, opening again. Her lips forming words that wouldn't come, nothing but tears and broken breaths. Beckett stepped to the side of the bed. He placed Zoe into Audrey's arms. Gently, slowly, carefully supporting the baby's head the right way, with the practiced precision of someone who had carried this child for 9 hours and learned how to keep her head in the right position after nearly getting it wrong 4 times. Then he stepped back. 1 step, 2 steps, far enough from the bed that Audrey wouldn't feel crowded. He remembered her eyes on the bridge. He remembered how she had recoiled at the sight of a man's face. He wouldn't let that happen again. Audrey held Zoe. Held her so tightly, doctor. Brennan had to remind her to be gentle because the IV line was pulling taut. She didn't hear him. She held her baby and kissed the top of her head, her forehead, her cheek, her nose, again and again, like she was counting every piece of her daughter's face to make sure nothing was missing. Then she whispered, voice breaking, tears dropping into Zoe's hair. "Mommy's here. Mommy's got you. I'm so sorry, baby. I'm so sorry." Zoe stirred, opened her eyes in a blur, looked at her mother, then closed them again and went right back to sleep. She didn't know anything. She didn't know her mother had almost died. She didn't know a stranger had held her for 9 hours. She didn't know her mother was crying. She only knew the familiar warmth of her mother, and that was enough. Audrey cried for a long time. The kind of crying you can't stop and don't want to stop. The kind she hadn't allowed herself for 3 years because crying in front of Travis meant weakness, and weakness meant being hit again. But here, in a small clinic room under fluorescent lights, holding her daughter, she let herself cry. When the tears finally thinned, she looked up. She looked at the man standing 2 steps from the bed, hands in his pockets, back against the wall. Eyes angled toward the window as if he were trying to give her space while still staying here. Wrinkled suit, dark circles. A drool-stained lapel. He didn't look dangerous. He didn't look like a kingpin. He looked like an exhausted father after a long night with a child. "You were here all night." Beckett looked at her and gave a small nod. She wouldn't sleep unless someone held her. "You stayed 9 hours with a baby you don't even know." "I do now." Silence. Long. Not uncomfortable. The kind of silence where both people feel the weight of it and neither wants to break it. Audrey looked at him. Not with evaluation. Not with fear. Not with polite gratitude. She looked at him like she was trying to understand something beyond her ability to understand. The question in her eyes wasn't "Who are you?" It was "Why?" Why did you stay? Why did a complete stranger hold her baby for 9 hours? Mix the formula wrong and try again. Put the diaper on backward and redo it. Sing a lullaby at 4 in the morning. Why? And Beckett Crane, the man no one in Chicago dared ask for reasons. The man whose every decision was calculated and every action had a purpose. Didn't know how to answer that question that night. He didn't know why he stayed. He only knew that when Zoe held his finger at 2 in the morning, when she looked at him with blue eyes exactly like her mother's, when she fell asleep on his chest and gripped his lapel like it was the safest thing in the world, something inside him, something he'd believed had died a long time ago, since the night Molly fell on the staircase, since the day his mother closed her eyes, year after year living in the dark, that something had suddenly taken a breath again. He didn't say any of that to Audrey. He only looked at her, nodded once more, and said, "Rest. I'll be out there if you need anything." Then he turned and walked out. Audrey didn't know his name. She didn't know what he did. She didn't know why he stayed. But she knew one thing. For the first time in 3 years, she looked at a man and didn't want to move backward. On the second day, Beckett came back to the clinic around midday. He brought a bag of food from a Vietnamese pho place on Argyle Street, because that morning Dr. Brennan had said she needed iron urgently. Beef, bone broth, leafy greens, and beef pho was the closest thing that packed all of that into one bowl. He also brought a smaller bag, inside it a set of baby clothes, a yellow onesie with a little duck on it. The reason was simple. That morning, when Beckett left the clinic to go home and shower and change, Zoe had been lying on her mother's bed, eyes fixed on the small television mounted on the wall, watching a children's program with a yellow duck. She'd smiled. So Beckett, a Chicago kingpin, stopped by a baby store on his way back and bought the outfit with the duck. He didn't explain himself to anyone. Leo drove, glanced in the rearview mirror, saw his boss holding baby clothes printed with a duck, and decided today was a day for silence rather than commentary. When Beckett stepped into the room, Audrey was sitting up in bed feeding Zoe a bottle. She looked up, and Beckett saw it immediately. She wasn't afraid of him the way she'd been on the bridge, but she didn't trust him yet either. Her eyes followed every movement he made, the way feral cats watch you, letting you come close but ready to bolt at any second. He set the pho on the table by the bed, set the bag of clothes beside it. Then he sat down on the chair in the corner of the room, 2 meters from the bed, far enough for her to feel at ease. They were quiet for a while. Audrey ate slowly, spoon by spoon, like someone who hadn't had hot food in a long time and had forgotten what it felt like. Zoe lay on the bed, playing with her own toes. Then Beckett asked, his voice gentle, not pressing, "Is there anyone I should call for you? Family? Friends? Anyone?" And Audrey collapsed. Not the kind of collapse where you faint, the kind where every wall she'd built around herself over 3 years fell at once. She set the spoon down, stared into the bowl of pho, and started to talk. She told him everything. About Travis, about 3 years, about the beatings, about makeup to hide bruises, about the night she was kicked in the stomach while pregnant, about her father-in-law, Federal Judge Howard Holloway, the man the entire Illinois police system bowed to, about the one time she'd called the police and they'd called the judge instead of filing a report, about 4 months hiding money, $340, about the night Travis turned toward Zoe, about bare feet on 2-degree sidewalks. She spoke like someone opening a floodgate after 3 years of blockage, without stopping, without breaks, tears running but her voice still going, because she was afraid that if she stopped she'd never be able to speak again. Beckett listened, sitting in the corner chair, hands clasped, back straight, eyes on her. He didn't interrupt. He didn't nod with fake sympathy. He didn't frown. He didn't say, "Why didn't you leave sooner?" The sentence everyone says to abuse victims. The sentence that sounds like concern, but is really blame. He just listened. And when Audrey finished, when she sat there with red eyes, shaking hands, a bowl of cold pho between them, he said only one thing: "You're safe now. He won't find you here. No grand promises. No declarations that he'd protect her forever." Just one sentence, simple and clear. And Audrey, without knowing why, believed him. That afternoon, Beckett came back again. He brought shoes, white sneakers, plain, common, nothing fancy. He set them by the bed without a word, without explanation. But Audrey understood. He remembered. He remembered her running barefoot on the bridge, remembered the scraped, bruised soles of her feet. And he'd brought shoes for her. She tried them on. Wrong size, one size too big. She didn't say anything. Beckett didn't either. But the next day, when he came back, there was another pair at the door. Same style, same color, the right size, set there without a single word. Travis Holloway had given Audrey a diamond ring on their wedding day. That ring had been a mark of ownership, a "you belong to me," a shackle wrapped in precious metal. Beckett Crane gave Audrey a pair of sneakers that fit, left at the door, without saying anything. "Those shoes didn't say you belong to me. Those shoes said I remember your feet hurt." And for the first time in her life, Audrey understood the difference between possession and care. That same day, Beckett called Leo from the car on the way back. "Dig up everything on Travis Holloway, son of Judge Howard Holloway. I want everything." Leo delivered the results within 24 hours. Travis had 3 prior domestic violence accusations. All 3 had been buried. Reports vanished. Complainants withdrew. One woman before Audrey, a former girlfriend, had been hospitalized for falling down the stairs. She left Illinois soon after, or was made to leave. No one knew. Beckett read the file and stayed silent for a long time. Then he said to Leo, "Put 2 men outside the clinic. Day and night. She doesn't need to know." And Leo, who'd heard Beckett give thousands of orders over 10 years, realized his boss's voice was different. When Beckett said protect her, it wasn't the voice of a man issuing commands. It wasn't the voice of a kingpin sending people to do a job. It was the voice of someone asking, the kind of voice Leo had never heard from this man. And Leo understood that something had changed. 2 days later, Audrey was discharged. Dr. Brennan told her to rest, eat properly, take iron supplements daily, and come back for a follow-up in a week. Audrey thanked him, lifted Zoe, slung the old backpack over her shoulder, and stepped out of the clinic door. She stood on the sidewalk of West Randolph Street at midday in November, cold wind cutting into her face, looking at a city of 8 million people, and had no idea where to go. $340 in a zip bag. Not enough for even a week's rent in Chicago. Audrey stood on the sidewalk for about 3 minutes before a black Escalade eased up to the curb beside her. The rear door opened. Beckett stepped out, not in a suit today, just a black jacket and dark pants. Less intimidating, but still the kind of man you crossed the street to avoid when you saw him coming your way. He took in Audrey standing there with Zoe in her arms, the backpack on her shoulder, her eyes on the traffic without really seeing it, and he knew she had nowhere to go. He knew before she spoke, because he'd prepared. "I've got a place," he said. "A small apartment, quiet neighborhood, paid for 3 months." Audrey turned to look at him, and her first reaction wasn't gratitude. She went rigid. Her eyes shifted from exhaustion to caution, the kind of caution 3 years with Travis had carved into her instincts. Because Travis had started the same way, offering her a place to live. Travis had started with, "I'll take care of you," and she knew the price of free gifts from men. "I don't take charity," she said. Not loud, not angry, but firm. It was probably the hardest sentence she'd said to a man in 3 years. And she said it to the Chicago Mafia boss. Beckett didn't look surprised. He didn't argue. He only said, "It's not charity. Think of it like an investment. You owe me a meal when you can cook." He knew she couldn't cook. Dr. Brennan had told him her nutritional state suggested she'd lived on fast food and packaged meals for years. But that line wasn't about cooking. It was saying, "This isn't a favor. This is an exchange. You don't owe anyone. You get to keep your dignity." And Audrey understood. She nodded. Leo drove them to an apartment complex on North Halsted Street, a quiet area with young families, far enough from downtown that no one would find her, close enough that she could still work. The apartment was on the 3rd floor. 1 bedroom, a small living room, a kitchen, a bathroom. Not big, not luxurious, but clean, warm. The kitchen cabinets held basic food. The refrigerator had fresh milk, eggs, vegetables. The bedroom had a crib for Zoe, brand new, tags still on it. The bed had a thick blanket and soft pillows. Beckett had arranged all of it in 2 days, while Audrey was still in the clinic. He didn't say so, but Audrey saw the new crib, the milk in the refrigerator, the blanket on the bed. And she knew. Someone had thought about her. Thought about every small thing she would need. Not the way Travis thought. Not control disguised as care. Not, "I'll take care of you," that really meant, "I'll decide for you." But the kind of thinking that says she'll need a crib for the baby. She'll need milk in the fridge. She'll need a warm blanket. The kind of thinking that comes from real concern. Beckett and Leo left. The door closed. And Audrey did something she would later describe through tears every time she remembered it. She locked the door, then unlocked it. Then locked it again. She stood there with her hand on the lock, turning it back and forth, and she cried. Because for the first time in 3 years, she had a door she controlled. Travis had kept the house key. Travis decided when she could go out and when she had to stay in. For 3 years, she hadn't had the right to lock or unlock any door. But this apartment, the key was in her hand. She locked it. She opened it. She decided. It sounded small, didn't it? A lock. But for someone who'd been imprisoned in her own home for 3 years, that lock was freedom. She stood in the middle of the living room holding Zoe and cried. This time she wasn't crying from pain. She wasn't crying from fear. She was crying from relief. Because for the first time, she had a safe place. In the first weeks, Beckett came 2 or 3 times a week. There was always a specific reason. Food because the refrigerator was getting low. Iron supplements because Dr. Brennan had instructed it. More clothes for Zoe because the baby was growing fast. He never stayed long. He never touched Audrey unless she touched him first. Every time he wanted to hold Zoe, he asked. Always asked. "Can I hold her?" 7 words. Every time. Never forgetting. He hired a lawyer for Audrey. Not a lawyer from the underworld. A civil attorney who specialized in domestic violence. An office on LaSalle Street. A Harvard degree. Someone who had won cases against senior judges. Beckett paid, but his name wasn't on anything. The file carried only Audrey Holloway. Divorce proceedings began, along with a petition for a restraining order. He helped her find a job. A receptionist position at a construction company on Wacker Drive. A legitimate company in the Crane Holdings network. Completely clean operations. Good coworkers. Hours that let her pick Zoe up from daycare. Audrey went to work on her first day wearing the white sneakers Beckett had brought the second time, the pair in the right size, and she started leaving small notes on the apartment table for Beckett. Handwritten, her pen strokes slightly shaky. "Thank you for the milk for Zoe. Thank you for the medicine. Thank you for the shoes." Small scraps, torn from a cheap notebook, written in blue ballpoint ink. Beckett never answered a single note, but he kept every one. All of them. folded them and put them in the desk drawer in his Crane Holdings office. Leo saw it once when he brought in a file, saw his boss carefully folding a small note and placing it into the drawer beside 3 others. Leo looked at Beckett with an expression he didn't bother to hide. The look of a man who knew his boss was done for. Completely. Beyond saving. Audrey was learning how to be safe, day by day, lock by lock, note by note, but she still hadn't learned how to trust. To trust a man being kind to her without a purpose. To trust that kindness could exist without a price attached. And Beckett, he was about to need more patience than any deal he'd ever negotiated in his life. In the 3rd week, the apartment door lock jammed. Audrey twisted the key again and again and couldn't get it open, and she had to call Beckett because she didn't know who else to call. He arrived within 20 minutes, without bringing a repairman, without calling anyone. He took off his jacket, rolled up his sleeves, pulled an old tool kit from the trunk that looked like it had been with him for years, and crouched in front of the door to take the lock apart with a screwdriver. Audrey stood behind him holding Zoe, watching the Chicago kingpin kneeling on the hallway floor of an apartment building, fixing a door lock with a screwdriver, and she asked, "You know how to fix locks?" Beckett didn't look up. Grew up on the South Side. Everything breaks. You learn to fix it, or you live with broken things. 15 minutes later, the lock opened. He didn't call a locksmith to replace it. He went out and bought a new lock himself and installed it that afternoon. 2 locks, 1 main and 1 secondary, because he said 1 lock wasn't safe enough. Audrey didn't know what he meant by safe, but she didn't ask. In the 4th week, Beckett brought over a baby car seat. Brand new, a good one, proper safety standards, he said. It belonged to a coworker. Their kid outgrew it. Audrey thanked him and strapped it into the stroller. That afternoon, Leo told Dr. Brennan when he stopped by the clinic to pick up medication for his boss. What coworker? He ordered it online at 3 in the morning. I saw the browser history. He was comparing 3 different car seats, reading reviews, watching crash test videos. 3 in the morning. Dr. Brennan looked at Leo. Leo looked back. Neither of them said anything else, but both of them understood. In the 2nd month, Beckett taught Audrey how to drive. She'd never had a license because Travis wouldn't let her take the test. So Beckett drove her to an empty lot in the southern suburbs, parked an old sedan he'd bought for her, then sat in the passenger seat and coached her. Audrey gripped the steering wheel, hands shaking. She pressed the gas too hard. The car lurched forward and slammed straight into a trash can in the corner of the lot. Beckett sat still for 3 seconds, then said with a completely straight face, "That trash can had it coming." Audrey looked at him. Then she smiled, just a little, the corner of her mouth, but real. And Beckett, the man Chicago didn't dare joke with, almost smiled back. They practiced for 2 more hours. Audrey hit another trash can and nearly drove into a fence. By the end, she managed to park, only off by about a meter. Beckett called that progress. Leo sat in the Escalade parked at the edge of the lot, shaking his head for the full 2 hours. In the 3rd month, Audrey began learning how to cook. She watched YouTube, a simple tutorial for pasta, the kind of tomato sauce noodles anyone could make. The first meal she cooked for Beckett, the pasta clumped into one sticky mass. The sauce burned black on the bottom of the pot, smoke filling the kitchen. Audrey stared at the plate of pasta that looked like a natural disaster and wanted to cry. Beckett sat down at the table, picked up his fork, and ate all of it. Every bite, no grimace. When he finished, he said, "It's good." Leo stood by the table, looked at his own plate, looked at Beckett, looked back at the plate, then said, "I ate already." And Audrey laughed, really laughed, from her belly, the kind of laugh that made her whole body shake, eyes narrowing, the sound filling the small kitchen. The first time she'd laughed like that since her mother died. She couldn't remember the last time she'd truly laughed. But it was here now, in a smoky kitchen, over burned pasta, and she laughed until tears ran down her face, and she didn't care. Zoe grew fast. 8 months became 9, then 10. She started crawling, then pulling herself up, then falling, then standing again. And Zoe loved Beckett. Not the slow kind of love. The instant love children have for the person who makes them laugh. Beckett sat on the floor playing with blocks with Zoe, patient enough that Leo stood outside the door and couldn't believe what he was seeing. Zoe handed Beckett a crayon and he drew on paper. Then Zoe took the crayon and drew on Beckett's face. A blue line across his cheek. a red line on his forehead, a yellow dot on his nose. Beckett didn't move, didn't flinch. Let the baby use his face like a canvas, his expression completely serious, like he was in a meeting with the most important business partner of his life. Leo took a photo. Beckett heard the click and looked up. Delete it. Leo slid the phone into his pocket. Already backed up. One evening, Beckett stayed and cooked noodles for Zoe. He boiled water, dropped in the noodles, then went to the living room to grab Zoe because she was crawling toward an electrical outlet. He forgot to turn off the stove. The water boiled away. The noodles burned. The smoke alarm shrieked. Zoe screamed. And when Beckett held Zoe with one arm, rushed into the kitchen and turned off the stove with the other, and said calmly, "It's not serious." While the pot of noodles was blackened, smoking like it had survived a fire, Audrey stood in the kitchen doorway watching the scene, a mafia boss holding a child with one hand, gripping a pot of burned noodles with the other, the alarm still blaring, his face completely serious as he said, "It's not serious." And she laughed until tears spilled, laughed until her stomach hurt, laughed until she had to sit down on the floor because her legs wouldn't hold her. This wasn't a movie. There was no kiss in the rain, no candles, no wine, no romantic background music, just burned noodles, crayon marks on a face, and a mafia boss hitting trash cans while teaching her to drive. But that was love, the real kind, the messy kind, the kind no one could script. Because who writes a scene where a kingpin sits on the floor letting a baby draw on his face, burns noodles, then says, "It's not serious" with the most serious face in the world? No one writes that. Because it's too real. Audrey was healing, day by day, laugh by laugh, burned noodle by burned noodle. But there were wounds you couldn't see with your eyes. They hid deep, silent, and only surfaced at 2 a.m. The first time it happened was on an ordinary afternoon. Beckett was sitting on the sofa, Zoe on the floor stacking blocks, Audrey in the kitchen pouring water. Beckett reached for the television remote on the table beside where Audrey stood. His hand moved quickly, crossing her line of sight, and Audrey flinched hard. The glass slipped from her hand. She folded in on herself, shoulders hunched, eyes squeezed shut, both hands lifting to cover her face, waiting for the hit. 3 years of reflex. Her body didn't need her mind to give an order. It reacted automatically to any sudden movement from a man near her. A raised hand meant a slap. A reaching arm meant a fist. 3 years trained by pain had turned her instincts into a survival response. And that response didn't disappear just because the hand moving now didn't belong to Travis. Beckett froze. His hand stopped in midair, 10 centimeters from the remote. He looked at Audrey crumpled in front of him, eyes shut, hands shielding her face, and something in his chest twisted so sharply he couldn't breathe for a second. He lowered his hand, slowly, and he didn't say anything. He didn't say, "I won't hit you." He didn't say, "You don't need to be afraid of me." He didn't say any sentence at all, because he understood words don't erase 3 years. Words are cheap. Travis had used words after every beating. Beckett just stayed still. He waited for Audrey to open her eyes. He waited for her to realize no blow was coming. He waited for her breathing to return to normal. Then he quietly picked up the glass from the floor, wiped up the spilled water, set the glass on the table, and said to Zoe, "You done with the blocks?" As if nothing had happened. As if he hadn't just watched the woman he cared about recoil in terror because his hand moved too fast. He didn't act wounded. He didn't ask. He waited. And it happened again, many times. He reached for the salt at the dinner table and Audrey startled. He shut a door a little too hard because of the wind and Audrey's shoulders jumped. He stood up too quickly from the sofa and Audrey took 2 steps back. Every time, Beckett reacted the same way. Stop. Lower his hand. Wait. Continue as normal. No hurt pride. No anger. No, why are you like this? Because he knew why. And he knew the only thing that could heal that reflex wasn't words. It was time. It was hundreds of times a hand moved and no blow followed. Hundreds of times a door closed and no shouting came. Hundreds of times a man stood near her and there was no pain. Her brain had to learn again, and Beckett gave her the time to learn. Then came the nightmare night. At 2 a.m, Beckett's phone buzzed. Audrey's number, he answered, and on the other end was fast breathing, muffled sobs, Audrey trying to speak and failing. Only I don't, and then silence. He didn't ask what happened. He only said, "I'm coming." 20 minutes later, He was at the apartment. Audrey opened the door, eyes red, hair a mess, wrinkled pajamas, hands shaking. She didn't say what the nightmare was about, but Beckett didn't need to ask. He knew. She'd dreamed of Travis. He stepped inside, looked at the bedroom where Zoe was sleeping soundly in her crib, then sat down on the living room sofa, took off his shoes, settled back with his hands folded over his stomach. He didn't go into the bedroom. He didn't come any closer to Audrey than the distance she allowed. He just sat there. Go to sleep. I'm here. Audrey looked at him from the bedroom doorway. Then she turned back inside, lay down on the bed, and for the first time in months, she fell asleep again in the middle of the night, because someone was on the other side of the door, not outside to keep her in, like Travis, outside to keep the darkness out. The next morning, Audrey woke at 6. She opened the bedroom door and found Beckett dozing on the sofa. His legs stuck out because the sofa was too short for him. His neck was tilted at an angle that would absolutely hurt when he woke. One arm hung down toward the floor, the other rested on his stomach. Someone, probably him half awake, had pulled the thin sofa blanket over his shoulders, but it only reached his chest, and the rest of him lay in the cold. Audrey stood there watching him sleep for a long time. Then she went to the bedroom closet, took the thick blanket from her bed, came back out, and draped it over him, gently, carefully, so she wouldn't wake him. Her hand brushed his shoulder through the blanket, only for a moment, light as wind, but it was the first time she had touched him on purpose. It sounded small, just a blanket, but for a woman who had been afraid to touch any man for 3 years, whose first reflex at a man's raised hand was to close her eyes and brace for pain, covering a sleeping man with a blanket was a revolution. It was the first step on the long road from fear to trust. After that, everything changed, slowly but surely, like ice melting. Not loudly, just dripping, one drop at a time. 4 months after the night on the bridge, on a Sunday afternoon, Audrey pushed Zoe's stroller on a walk through the neighborhood park. Beckett walked beside her, hands in his coat pockets, matching her pace. The March wind was softer than November, but it still carried cold. They walked along the paved path past bare trees, saying nothing. Then Audrey slipped her hand into Beckett's, lightly, shaking. Her fingers were cold and thin, sliding between his fingers, and she held on. Not tight, just enough to say she was here, he was here, and she was choosing this. Beckett didn't squeeze back. He held her hand, just enough. Not more, not less. Enough for her to know he wasn't going anywhere, but not so tight she felt held, because he understood that for Audrey, the difference between holding hands and being held was that she could pull away whenever she wanted. Zoe had started saying "bae" more clearly the week before. Not his name, but close enough. Whenever she heard footsteps outside the apartment door, she would toddle out, fall, stand up again, toddle faster, open her mouth and call "bae," arms lifted to be picked up. Beckett picked her up every time, looking to Audrey first, asking with his eyes, and only then lifting Zoe. And every time Zoe called "bae," the corner of Beckett's mouth twitched, the smallest movement you'd miss if you weren't watching. But Leo saw it, and Audrey saw it too. Audrey was falling in love. She knew it. She knew it in the way her heart beat when she heard the Escalade pull up outside. She knew it in the way she started cooking on the days he came, even though the noodles still burned. She knew it in the way she watched him hold Zoe and felt something warm uncurl in her chest, something she'd believed had died long ago. And for the first time, that thought didn't make her afraid. 6 months after the night on the bridge, Beckett asked Audrey to go to dinner. Not the kind of dinner where he brought pho to a clinic room or sat eating burned noodles at a small kitchen table. A real dinner. 2 people. No Zoe. Audrey took 3 days to decide, not because she didn't want to, but because this was the first time in 4 years she would be having dinner with a man without being forced, controlled, or afraid. She wanted to go, and the fact that she wanted to go was what frightened her, because the last time she wanted something from a man, she lost 3 years of her life. Leo watched Zoe. It was the kind of sight no one would believe if they saw it. Leo Marsh, Beckett Crane's right hand, the man the Chicago underworld made room for, sitting on the floor of Audrey's apartment, stacking blocks with a 1-year-old, his face serious as if he were overseeing a $1 million deal. Zoe handed Leo a block that didn't fit. Leo looked at the piece, looked at Zoe, then set it in the correct place. Zoe clapped. Leo nodded, as if a mission had been completed. Beckett took Audrey to a small Italian restaurant on Taylor Street in Little Italy. Not a fancy place. Not a place a kingpin went to conduct business. This was where Beckett had eaten since he was a boy. The owner's name was Maria, 70 years old, silver hair twisted into a bun, a white apron permanently stained with tomato sauce. She'd known Beckett since he was 10, when his mother brought him and Molly here every Friday night, the only luxury meal of the week. Maria watched Beckett walk in with Audrey, looked from him to her and back to him, then smiled the way older women smile when they know what's going to happen before it happens, and led them to the quietest corner table. They talked for 4 hours. 4 hours. Food arrived and was cleared away. The candle on the table burned down and was replaced. The bottle of wine was opened and emptied, and they kept talking. Audrey told him about her mother, about Diane Pennington, a night shift nurse, a woman who worked 12 hours every night and still came home to cook for her child without ever saying she was tired. She told him about the silver bracelet, the one her grandmother had given her mother the day she graduated. The bracelet Audrey had removed from her mother's wrist at the funeral home. She was wearing it now, turning it on her wrist as she spoke, exactly the way her mother used to turn it every night before going to work. She told him about the childhood dream she once had, to be a teacher, 2nd grade or 3rd, because she loved the way children at that age looked at the world. Everything new, everything miraculous, everything worth asking why. She said she had given up that dream a long time ago, but the way she spoke, her eyes brightened, and Beckett knew she hadn't given it up. She had only put it away. Then Beckett told her about Molly. For the first time, he told anyone other than Leo. His voice didn't change. Still low, still slow, still controlled, but his hand tightened around the wineglass, and his eyes dropped to the table instead of meeting Audrey's. Because if he looked at her, then he wasn't sure he could keep his voice steady. He told her about the South Side, about his father, Frank Crane, a low-level runner for the local mob, a gambling addict buried under debt. About his mother, Ruth, a grocery store cashier who sang "Fly Me to the Moon" every night. About Molly, his sister, 5 years younger, blonde, laughing more than anyone Beckett had ever known. Then he told her about that night. He was 14, Molly was 9. The men came to the house to collect his father's debt. His mother was beaten in front of the children. Molly panicked and ran up the stairs. She tripped. She fell. Her head hit the last step. That sound, Beckett said. He had heard it every night for 22 years. It never stopped. Molly lived, but the brain injury was permanent. 9 years old forever inside a 31-year-old body, his father ran right after that. His mother broke, and Beckett, 14 years old, stepped into the underworld. Not because he wanted to, because of Molly's medical bills, because of his father's debt, because there was no one else. He paid off his father's debt in 2 years. He covered Molly's care from then on. Every month he visited her. Molly lived in a care home on the north side of the city, a bright room with a window facing a garden. Every time Beckett walked in, Molly screamed Beck and ran to hug him, smiling like he'd just returned from a long trip. She still smiled. She still held his hand. She was still 9, forever 9. And every time Beckett left the care home, he sat in his car, closed his eyes, and waited for the ache in his chest to ease before he drove away. His iron rule, the rule anyone in his organization paid dearly to violate: never touch women and children. Because of Molly. Because of his mother. Because of that staircase night. Audrey listened in silence. She didn't interrupt, didn't cry, didn't say "I understand," because she knew she couldn't fully understand. But she understood enough. She understood why Beckett had saved her on the bridge that night. He hadn't seen a stranger. He had seen his mother 22 years ago, beaten on a kitchen floor. He had seen 9-year-old Molly falling down the stairs. He had seen every time he hadn't been fast enough to save someone. And that night, on the Michigan Avenue Bridge, for the first time, he'd been fast enough. When Beckett drove Audrey home, she sat in the passenger seat in silence for a while. Then she said, softly but clearly, "Thank you. Not for dinner. For showing me men don't have to be something I fear." Beckett didn't answer. He stopped the car in front of her building, waited until she climbed to the 3rd floor, waited until the apartment light turned on, and only then drove away. He went home, parked in the garage, and sat there. In the car, in the dark, both hands on the steering wheel. For a long time, he thought about Audrey, about the way she turned the silver bracelet when she spoke about her mother. About the way her eyes lit up when she talked about teaching. About the way she looked at him when he spoke about Molly, not with pity, not with fear, but with understanding. And for the first time in 20 years, Beckett Crane thought, maybe I deserve to be happy. But happiness has a price. And Audrey's past wasn't finished with her yet. 2 months after dinner at the Italian restaurant, 8 months after the night on the bridge, the past came looking. Federal Judge Howard Holloway wasn't the kind of man who accepted losing. He'd lost a daughter-in-law, lost a granddaughter, and more than that, he'd lost control. For a man who had used the entire legal system as a personal tool for 30 years, that was not acceptable. He used connections to pull citywide security footage. He used his authority as a federal judge to dig for data without needing a warrant. He had his people comb through district after district until they found an image of Audrey appearing near North Halstead, and he gave the information to Travis. 10 at night, Thursday. Audrey had just put Zoe to sleep and was sitting on the bed with a book. The first book she'd read since leaving Travis's home. Because now she had time, she had light, she had a quiet she didn't have to fear being shattered by fists. Then the pounding started. Not knocking. Pounding. The kind that shook the hallway. The kind made by a drunk man's fist slamming into wood like he meant to smash straight through it. And a voice Audrey recognized the instant she heard it, even after 8 months, even after forcing herself to forget it every day. Travis, open the door. You think you can run. Zoe is my kid. You don't have the right to hide my kid from me. Audrey's world collapsed in 3 seconds. Everything she'd rebuilt over 8 months, every laugh, every quiet night of sleep, every time she'd held Beckett's hand in the park, all of it vanished, and she was right back where she'd been. On the floor, curled up, waiting for the blow. She didn't think. Her body moved on its own. She ran into the bedroom, lifted Zoe from the crib, the baby jolting awake and screaming, and Audrey sat down in the corner, back against the wall, arms wrapped around Zoe like a living shield, exactly like the night she'd placed herself between Travis and the crib 8 months earlier. Exactly like so many nights across 3 years. The flashbacks hit at the same time, uncontrollable. The sound of glass shattering against the wall, Travis shouting behind her. The smell of bourbon flooding her nose, even though there was no bourbon here, but her brain couldn't tell anymore. Her brain was back in the 12th floor apartment, back on the kitchen floor, back in every terror-filled night she'd believed she had left behind. She folded inward. She shut her eyes. She waited for the hit. 3 years of reflex didn't vanish. It lived there beneath every laugh and burned noodle and crayon mark, waiting for the right trigger to snap awake. And Travis pounding on the door was the perfect trigger. Zoe cried harder. Audrey held her tighter, pressed her face into Zoe's hair, whispering the same words she'd whispered in Dr. Brennan's clinic. Mommy's here. Mommy's got you. Mommy's here. Over and over, not knowing if she was saying it to her child or to herself. The pounding continued. Travis yelled, his voice thick with alcohol but still loud enough to cut through walls. I know you're in there. Open up. I'll break this door down. Audrey thought about the lock. 2 locks, the ones Beckett had installed. 1 main lock and 1 secondary. He'd said 1 lock wasn't safe enough. Now she understood what he meant by safe. The door didn't open. The locks held. But the pounding didn't stop, and Audrey didn't know how long the locks would hold. Then the pounding stopped, abruptly, like someone hit a mute button. Silence for 2 seconds. 3. And then another voice spoke. Not loud, not shouting. The opposite. Soft. Soft in a way that was dangerous. The kind of softness that, if you'd lived close enough to Chicago's underworld long enough, you knew was more frightening than any scream. Beckett's voice. Audrey couldn't make out the words. Through a closed door, through Zoe's crying, she caught only the sound of it, the rhythm, the tone, slow, 1 word at a time. Flat. And Travis, who had been screaming like a madman 3 seconds earlier, went completely silent, not a sound. Audrey sat in the bedroom corner holding Zoe and listened to that silence. And she cried, not from fear. She'd done enough of that. She cried from relief, because for the first time in her life, someone was standing between her and the monster. For 3 years, Audrey had stood alone between Travis and Zoe, blocking him with her own body, with cracked ribs and bruises and a split lip. No one came. No one stopped him. She called the police, and the police called the judge, and the judge called back, and called it a family matter. She screamed and no one heard. She endured and no one knew. For 3 years, every beating, she took it alone. But tonight, in the hallway outside the door she was hiding behind, someone was there. Someone was blocking. A voice that could make Travis Holloway, a man who'd beaten his wife for 3 years without anyone daring to stop him, go silent, as if the world had hit mute. And that sound, Travis going silent, that sudden silence after 8 months, was the most beautiful sound Audrey Holloway had ever heard. More beautiful than Zoe's laughter. More beautiful than Fly Me to the Moon at 4 a.m. Because it was the sound of, "You're not alone anymore." Outside the door, Beckett Crane was looking straight into Travis Holloway's eyes. And Travis, for the first time in his life, felt afraid. Beckett didn't hit Travis. He didn't need to. There are men who are dangerous because they hit, and there are men who are dangerous because they don't have to. Beckett stood 1 step away from Travis, arms relaxed at his sides, and said, very softly, so slowly that every word landed clear, "Call your father. Ask him the name Beckett Crane. Then decide whether you want to stand here any longer or whether you want to leave." Travis was still drunk, but survival instinct woke up faster than reason. He stared at Beckett, then at the 2 men behind him he hadn't even noticed arrive, then at the empty hallway, because it was 10 at night and no one was going to stick their head out after hearing fists on a door and a man screaming. Travis pulled out his phone, his hand shaking, and dialed his father. Federal Judge Howard Holloway answered after 2 rings. Travis said the name, and on the other end there was silence for 3 seconds. Then the judge's voice, the most powerful man in Illinois' justice system, the man police officers addressed as Sir, trembled. "Stay away from him. Go home. Now." Travis looked at Beckett again, and in Travis's eyes, something Audrey would never know but Beckett saw clearly, was fear. Travis Holloway, a man who'd beaten his wife for 3 years, a man who'd never feared anyone because his father always covered him, felt fear for the first time. He stepped back, turned, walked away, didn't look back. But Beckett knew it wasn't over. Travis would leave, but Howard Holloway wouldn't stop. Power doesn't accept losing. It only changes tactics. And it did. 1 week later, Audrey received a court summons. Judge Holloway filed for custody of Zoe, claiming the mother was mentally unstable, living off a dangerous element to society, financially unfit to raise a child. Every word was a lie, but when the petitioner was a federal judge, lies carried the weight of law. Beckett read the summons in the Crane Holdings office, his face unchanged, but Leo saw his fingers crush the paper until it wrinkled. Beckett called the attorney he'd hired for Audrey and handed over everything. Photos of Audrey's injuries, doctor. Brennan had taken and saved the first night. The bruised face, the cracked ribs on X-ray, the scraped soles of her feet, the records of 3 prior domestic violence complaints against Travis that his father had buried, the record of the ex-girlfriend hospitalized for falling down the stairs and then disappearing. Then Beckett met Judge Holloway alone. The meeting happened in a dark office on a Tuesday afternoon, known to no one but the 2 of them. Beckett didn't tell Audrey what was said, and he never would. All anyone knew was that when Beckett left the judge's office, Holloway withdrew the custody petition. Travis signed the divorce papers, surrendered every right to Zoe, and left Illinois within 2 weeks. Beckett had his ways. He always had ways. And sometimes those ways didn't require fists, only the right information, at the right time, and the right look when he said, "Or this goes to the press tomorrow morning." On the drive back, Leo sat behind the wheel and watched the rearview mirror. Watched Beckett in the back seat with his eyes closed, his head tipped against the window. Leo spoke, his voice lower than usual. "You're gambling everything for her. You know that, right?" Beckett opened his eyes and looked into the mirror. Not for her, for the child, so she grows up without being hit. If that isn't worth it, nothing is. Leo didn't say anything after that. He drove on, and in the silence both men understood Beckett had just used a portion of his power, risked his position, risked the anonymity he'd built his entire life, for a woman and a baby whose names he hadn't known 8 months earlier. Audrey learned in the afternoon when the lawyer called. The divorce was final. She had full custody, 100%. Travis had no rights to Zoe. The judge had withdrawn the petition. Done. Finished. She sat on the apartment floor while Zoe played with blocks beside her, and she laughed, then cried, then laughed, then cried, at the same time. The kind of feeling no language has a word for. When the thing you thought would cling to you for life suddenly lets go, and you feel so light you're afraid you might float away. She called Beckett. He answered, and she couldn't speak. She only cried. A long silence. Breathing. Tears. Then Beckett said, his voice low and slow and softer than Leo had ever heard it. "You're free now, Audrey." 3 words. "You're free now." And Audrey cried for 10 more minutes before she ended the call. That night, Beckett came to the apartment. Zoe was asleep. Audrey opened the door, her eyes swollen and red, but her gaze was different. No fear, no caution. She looked straight at him and asked, "Who are you, really?" Beckett stood in the doorway, silent for a long time. Then he told the truth. Not all of it, but enough. Enough for her to understand he wasn't an ordinary businessman. Enough for her to know what the name Beckett Crane carried in this city. Enough for her to have a choice, to stay or to leave. Audrey listened, quiet. Then she said, her voice steady, her eyes not looking away, "I'm not afraid of you. I've been afraid enough in my life, and you're the only person who makes me feel safe." And Beckett Crane, the man Chicago wouldn't dare meet eye to eye, the man whose every decision was cold calculation, the man no one could see inside because he never allowed it, was seen that night, truly seen. Known for what he was, known for what he did, and not feared. It was the one thing Beckett Crane had needed to hear more than anything. Someone saw him, both the light and the dark, and chose to stay. She was free. He was seen. And now there was only one question left. Would 2 people who had spent their lives believing they didn't deserve love dare to take the next step? A year and a half after the night, on the Michigan Avenue Bridge, the small apartment on North Halsted Street, a Saturday night, Zoe was almost 2, her pale blonde hair a little longer now, her blue eyes still exactly like her mother's, sitting on the living room floor in the middle of blocks scattered everywhere. She picked up a star-shaped piece, studied it, then threw it straight at Beckett's leg. Not angry throwing, the kind of throwing toddlers do because it's funny, because the sound of plastic thudding against an adult's shin is satisfying. Beckett looked at the piece on the floor, looked at Zoe grinning wide, then looked at Audrey in the kitchen pouring tea. And he knew this was the moment. He took a breath. Then he went down on one knee, not to pick up the block. One knee, in front of Audrey, in the middle of a living room cluttered with children's toys, under the soft yellow light of a small apartment. Audrey turned, teacup in hand, and stopped. The cup froze in her fingers. Beckett pulled a small box from his jacket pocket, opened it. Inside was a silver ring. Simple. No diamonds. No gemstones. Just smooth, polished silver, catching a quiet shine under the lamp. The kind of ring Travis Holloway would have sneered at because it wasn't worth 1/10 of the diamond ring he'd given Audrey on their wedding day. But that diamond ring had been a cuff. This silver ring was a choice. Beckett looked up at Audrey, and for the first time his voice wasn't fully controlled. It trembled, only slightly, but enough for Audrey to notice, because she had learned to read every smallest shift on a man's face for 3 years just to survive, and that tremble told her he was afraid. Beckett Crane, the man all of Chicago feared, was afraid she would say no. "I'm not perfect," he said. "I'm never going to be perfect. I've done things you know about, and things you don't. And by any standard the world sets, I don't deserve you. But that night on the bridge, when I held Zoe, when she grabbed my finger at 2 a.m, for the first time in my life I wanted to be better. Not for me, for you, for Zoe. I'm not asking you to save me. I'm just asking to walk beside you." Audrey stood still. The teacup shook in her hand. Tears were already running and she didn't even know when they'd started. Then Zoe toddled over, yelling, "Bay, Bay," wrapped both arms around Beckett's leg while he knelt, lost her balance, flopped onto his thigh, then reached for the nearest block and tossed it at his head. The piece hit Beckett's forehead and dropped to the floor. Zoe laughed. Beckett looked at Zoe, looked at Audrey, and Audrey laughed, laughing through tears, the kind of laugh that shook her whole body, the kind that burst out before she could speak, and the answer was already inside that laugh before she could even nod. She nodded. No diamond ring, no violin, no candlelit restaurant or glittering skyline behind them, just a living room floor covered in blocks, a child throwing toys at the groom's head, and 2 people who once believed they didn't deserve love finding each other in the ruins of their own lives. The wedding happened 6 months later, at Maria's Italian restaurant on Taylor Street, the same place as their first date. 30 people. No more. Audrey's co-workers from the construction company, a few of Beckett's trusted people, Maria crying through the ceremony even though she insisted it was the onions. Leo Marsh stood as best man, wearing a suit for the first time in his life, less comfortable than he was with a gun, but not as terrible as you'd expect. Zoe was the flower girl. She was almost 2.5, dressed in white, handed a small basket full of rose petals to scatter down the aisle. She scattered 3 petals, ate 5, threw the basket at a guest's foot, then ran to wrap herself around Beckett's leg and refused to let go. He carried her for the rest of the ceremony, his left arm holding Zoe, his right hand holding Audrey's. When Audrey put on her wedding dress, simple and white, no long train, no complicated lace, she wore her mother's silver bracelet on her left wrist. But the bracelet was different today. Brighter, smoother. Audrey turned it, looked closely, and realized someone had had it repaired and polished. The scratches were softened. The surface of the silver was clean again. It was still her mother's old bracelet, but it had been healed. Audrey looked at Beckett. He didn't say anything, but she knew. Somehow he had taken the bracelet, gotten it fixed, returned it, and she hadn't even noticed. Something old, something mended, like her, the first dance. Audrey and Beckett in the middle of the small restaurant, Maria turning off all the lights except for candles, and the song began. Fly Me to the Moon, the song Ruth Crane used to sing every night, the song Beckett had sung at 4 a.m. so Zoe would fall asleep on his shoulder in the clinic hallway. Now it was their wedding dance. Audrey rested her head against Beckett's chest, listened to his heart, and thought of her mother, of the words she used to say every night before leaving for work. You deserve to be loved the right way. Mom, I found it. Leo stood in the corner with a glass of whiskey, his back to the wall, watching Beckett sway slowly with Audrey in candlelight, watching Zoe sitting on Maria's lap, eating more petals, watching his boss smile. A real smile. A smile that reached his eyes, the kind of smile Leo had never seen in 10 years of following Beckett Crane. Leo took a sip of whiskey and muttered under his breath, "Damn Michigan Avenue Bridge." And the story could end here, with the slow dance, with candlelight, with the mended silver bracelet, with Zoe's laughter. But the best part, the part that makes all of it mean something, is 5 years later, 5 years after the night on the Michigan Avenue Bridge. Audrey was 32, Beckett was 41, and their life didn't look like anything either of them had ever imagined. They lived in a 4-bedroom house in the western suburbs of Chicago, a quiet neighborhood, the kind where neighbors say good morning and kids ride bikes on the sidewalk after school. The house had a backyard, and a big oak tree that Beckett was building a treehouse in every weekend. He was building it with his own hands, not hiring anyone, because he'd grown up on the south side and fixing things was a skill he never lost. Zoe was in charge. She was 6, standing under the trunk with her hands on her hips, yelling, "It's crooked, Daddy!" To the left, more left. Beckett, the Chicago kingpin, up in the tree with a hammer, took orders from a 6-year-old and moved it left. Zoe Crane. Not Zoe Holloway anymore. Beckett had officially adopted her 2 years earlier, and the name on her birth certificate now read Zoe Crane. She knew Beckett wasn't her biological father. Audrey and Beckett didn't hide it, because they believed the truth deserved better than any lie, no matter how gentle. But Zoe also knew this. Beckett chose her. Not out of duty, not out of blood, because that night on the bridge, he picked her up, and he never put her down again. She called him Daddy, and every time he heard it, the corner of Beckett's eye twitched, the smallest flicker, the kind only Audrey and Leo noticed, and both of them pretended they didn't. Asher was 3, their second child, black hair like his father's, blue eyes like his mother's, running faster than Zoe and falling 3 times as often, but never crying. Penny was 1, their youngest. Her full name was Penny Diane Crane, Penny for Pennington, Audrey's maiden name, Diane for her grandmother. Audrey named her youngest daughter after her mother, the night shift nurse who used to sing at her bedside and say, "You deserve to be loved the right way." "Mom, I found it, and I named my daughter for you so you'd know." Audrey became a teacher, 2nd grade, exactly the dream she'd had as a child. She stood in front of her classroom every morning and watched 7- and 8-year-olds look at the world as if everything was miraculous. And she remembered that she had once looked at the world that way too, before Travis, Before the abuse, before everything. Now she looked again. Beckett was still Beckett. Crane Holdings still ran. But he was shifting it, bit by bit, piece by piece, into legitimacy. Not clean yet, maybe never fully clean, but he was walking that road one step at a time. For Zoe, for Asher, for Penny, for Audrey, for his mother's words. Keep the good part of you. Don't let it die. Every Sunday, the whole family visited Molly. The care home on the north side, a bright room with a window facing a garden. Molly was 36 now, her mind still 9. She still shouted, "Beck!" when she saw him. She still smiled. Zoe called her Aunt Molly, and every week she brought a drawing as a gift. Child drawings. Messy, bright, full of color. Molly taped every one to the wall. The wall was covered now. The first time Audrey met Molly, she sat beside her sister-in-law, held Molly's hand, and said softly, "Thank you for teaching your brother how to love." Molly didn't understand the sentence. Molly only smiled and held Audrey's hand back, but Beckett stood in the doorway and heard it, and he had to turn his face away for a while. One Sunday afternoon in November, 5 years after that night, the family took a walk across the Michigan Avenue Bridge. Zoe ran ahead, blonde hair flying in the wind. Asher sat on Beckett's shoulders, both hands gripping his father's hair, laughing. Penny sat in the stroller, while Audrey pushed, a red scarf around her neck, cheeks pink from the cold. They crossed the bridge like hundreds of other families on a Sunday walk. No one looked twice. No one knew the story. Audrey stopped. Right there, the spot where 5 years earlier, on a November night, she had fallen. The spot where her knees buckled. Her vision went dark. Her arms tightened around Zoe, and the last thought in her head was, "Don't drop my baby." The spot where Beckett had dropped to his knees on dirty concrete in a $3,000 suit and caught them both. She looked down at the concrete. Then she looked at Beckett. He looked back. He didn't speak. They both knew where they were. Audrey slid her hand into Beckett's, like that Sunday 4 years earlier in the park. But this time her hand didn't shake. Sometimes the person who saves you isn't an angel. Sometimes it's the man the whole world calls a devil. But darkness recognizes darkness, and the one who's lived inside it the longest is the only one who knows how to lead you back to the light. Audrey and Beckett's story wasn't a fairy tale. There was no magic. No one was perfect. There was only a woman braver than she knew, a man better than he believed, and an 8-month-old baby gripping a stranger's finger at 2 in the morning that changed everything. If this story teaches us anything, it's this. You don't have to be perfect to deserve love. You don't have to be strong every day to be called brave. And sometimes love doesn't arrive with diamond rings or grand promises. It arrives with the right-size sneakers left at your door, with a burned bowl of noodles that someone eats anyway and calls good, with a person who sits on the sofa outside your door all night, just so you can sleep in peace. If this story touched you, please hit like so more people can hear it. Share it with someone you think needs to believe real love still exists. And subscribe to the channel so every day we can listen to more stories like this together. How do you feel after this story? Was there a moment that made you think about your own life? About the people who stayed beside you when everything felt like it was collapsing? Share with us in the comments, because every story you carry deserves to be heard, and we always want to hear what's in your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peaceful days. Goodbye, and see you in the next video.